geopolitical issues, and most notably as it related to West Asia policy. The minister has had tremendous experience in working with the present prime minister, and he shared some rare principles and glimpses of what is called as Modi's doctrine and his leadership style. So we would like to hear more as it relates to some of the principles that enshrines Modi's foreign policy, and that will provide the framework for us in terms of discussing further based on his observations. Over to you, sir, in terms of the continuation of the discussion, and we greatly benefited from the whole notion of, reach and inclusive development last time.
Thank you very, very much. Wonderful to be back with this worldwide audience and your specific program, which is really very widely viewed and has had so much impact. I will hope this time to keep my opening remarks as brief as possible, so that we certainly give far more opportunity to you and to my friend Mohandas to intervene with their comments and with your comments and questions and so on and so forth. Now, to begin with the Prime Minister's conceptual framework for a foreign policy. This is what we are really hoping to discuss today. If I had to actually put the two bookends for this conceptual framework, I would define them around security and development. The Prime Minister has always made it categorically clear that philosophically, for him, the world is a family. It goes back to a very familiar Sanskrit shlok saying. And on that basis, he truly, in his heart, mind, senses, and in his policy making, believes that. That's where the springboards of his thinking arise from. But you have to put that into a contemporary context. Now, all of us want peace, the Prime Minister no less than anyone else. But for him, peace is not submissive. Peace is assertive. Peace is a active peace. It is based on the maintenance of secure, acceptable. I'm reluctant to say borders because so many borders are in dispute. We do not recognize, for example, the border that we have at the moment, what is called the line of control with, for example, our western neighbor, Pakistan, because they have actually transgressed and occupied our territory through a war which they began within actually 6 weeks of 1947. It's one of the more amazing facts of world history that two new countries have just achieved independence. And the very first thing a country does is actually to declare war on the other. And this is what Pakistan did over the then dominion of Jammu and Kashmir, or the princely state, of Jammu and Kashmir, which had a standstill arrangement with both nations. Of course, we know that Jammu and Kashmir then legally and formally acceded to the state of the Indian Union. And by the way, just to remind everyone, the first state to recognize the legality of the accession of Jammu and Kashmir to India was Britain. And Britain was the power at that time. It was the one handing over freedom. Because, why do I say that? Because the last Viceroy and the first Governor General of in 47, we were dominions. We were not actually fully independent. Because the first Governor General, Lord Mountbatten, actually accepted the legality of the accession. Without him accepting the legality of the accession, he would not have allowed the British officers of the Indian Army to respond to aggression, to give only one example. We have had disputes with our neighbor to the north, China as well. And so I'm reluctant to use the word, borders, because we don't recognize at the moment the line, we call them line of actual control. But whatever it is at this moment, the Prime Minister's thinking is very clear that, we shall have security in our country, and this security will not be affected by either cross-border aggression or cross-border terrorism. In both cases, there shall be accountability. We want peace, and in order to keep the peace, we have actually gone the extra mile. We have accepted situations that have been imposed upon us by history. But if anyone thinks that they are going to gain anything by further aggression, they are making a huge mistake. Recently, I would like to draw your attention. The Prime Minister made our Prime Minister, Prime Minister Modi, made a very, very significant statement, which will be, when I think, or probably is being examined and re-examined very carefully. He said, the age of expansionism is over. Now, that is the fulcrum of what we could call a Modi doctrine, that the age of expansionism is over. Now, this is a very modern idea. Till certainly 100 years ago, and even till the Second World War, the world really was grappling with the ancient geopolitics of empires and colonies. May I just point another fact that might startle you? Till the end of the Second World War, conquest was legal.
Legal.
Yes. We all challenged the morality of the British Empire or the British Raj. Nobody ever challenged the legality of the British Raj.
Or any of the other conquests around the world.
Of the world. The First World War and the Second World War were wars of conquest. People may have liked or not liked it, or defended or not defended, but nobody actually challenged the legality of it because it was perfectly permissible. It is not until the coming of the acceptance of the UN Charter that conquest actually became accepted as illegal and unacceptable. So, in historical terms, this is a very modern concept, right? And what does the collapse and the vacuum left behind by empires? Today, the architecture of international stability is controlled by the sanctity of the nation state. And the nation state's stability thereby becomes the principal building block of the architecture of stability. When the Prime Minister says that the age of expansionism is over, he is making a very large point. Why is he making it? Because there are some powers who have replaced the old colonialism with what I call soft colonialism. This soft colonialism has very hard consequences, has very hard implications. So the use of the word soft should not mislead us. But the message went out loud and clear that even this kind of quasi-colonialism, if you like, or this kind of expansionism was certainly not going to be acceptable, right? We in India say that we have defense forces, we mean it. Everybody claims to have defense forces, but many countries have offense forces. We, on the other hand, truly have a defense force. This is what gives our armed forces that much extra strength, because they know that they are always in the right. We do not want anyone else's territory. On the other hand, we will not permit a single inch of our territory to be taken. And indeed, if there is any violation, there shall be accountability. Along with this is the urge for development, which is very central to our Prime Minister's view of international engagement. That the best, the biggest peace dividend must be the dividend of development which is equitable, development that goes down and helps change the lives for the better of the poorest of the poor. And this is why you will see in many contexts, India is the first nation to help when there is a serious natural disaster, the kind of improvements that we have made in our abilities to manage natural disasters. Whether it is an earthquake in Nepal, or whether there is a cyclone, or whatever might be. Today, we made every effort, despite our internal pressures. Prime Minister made sure that whatever we had, we would share in the fight against the COVID pandemic. And indeed, if our projections do succeed, and we almost must paraphrase this with if, then, and India is in a position to create a vaccine at some early date, I am sure that every effort will be made after, naturally, looking after our own people, to share this capacity and help. We are already in the process of talking about ensuring that, for example, such vaccines should not be overpriced or beyond the pricing capability of many of the poorer countries. You must recall and remember that India led the world in the war against HIV through our medical industry, right? And we created packages. What, Mohan, must have been 100 the cost?
Yes, $1.
Or something like like that. And we shared. This is the philosophy that infuses our relationships. And this is the philosophy which actually countries which might have been once skeptical about us, or even those countries which used to allege that we are all talk and hot air, nothing practical, have now totally revised their attitude towards us, because now we are on the ground, meeting challenges as they emerge, and always willing to go back to the philosophy that if the world is a family, then it is our duty, an obligation to help those members of the family who are in distress. There's one more point that I would like to make before we move on to Mohan's very tough questions, which is that India has been considered synonymous with the policy of non-alignment for many, many years. And even now, that remains a kind of thinking in people's minds that we are. Let me just say, I don't want to get into the merits of whether this idea was good or bad. It may have been useful in the 1950s. But as far as our practical experience of non-alignment is concerned, it has not always been very happy. The non-aligned movement started off in Belgrade in 1960. In 1962, when there was aggression against us, non-alignment didn't seem to help us very much. Then in 1965, when there was again aggression against us, then all the friends that we had built up through the non-aligned movement, many of them were looking not merely away from us, but were being supportive to those who were aggressors. and so on and so forth. Be that as it may, today, I think where we are moving, where we are moving towards a more positive concept. Right? Once again, I said, let us leave the merits and demerits of non-alignment behind us and think of what is relevant to our present context. And what we are working towards, in my view, is towards a series of a philosophy of multi-alignment.
Multi-alignment.
Yes, in which we actually have created very important bilateral relationships with a large number of nations, with every nation which actually is in a position to improve this bilateral relationship with us, and then to work this into a multilateral framework of cooperation. But the multilateral framework of cooperation is actually finds substance in the practical realities and the practical mutually beneficial development that emerges out of bilateral cooperation. These are not simply resolutions. They are grounded in positive and realistic cooperation. The 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 spirit with which we are approaching this new environment is a spirit in which we know that the bilateral element of our relationship becomes the bridge which interconnects with other bridges. One of the most interesting aspects of the success of the Prime Minister's foreign policy is the extraordinary ability and the extraordinary achievement in which we have been able to maintain very good relations, almost equally good relations, with nations which may be hostile to one another. Right? And people are always surprised. I may have mentioned this earlier as well, but it bears repetition that yes, the Prime Minister of Israel can come as a welcome guest to our country on a state visit in January 1918. And in the same month, the Prime Minister of India can make the first ever Prime Ministerial visit to Palestine and there receive the highest civilian award. It is our ability to actually maintain equations across binaries that is a very, very significant achievement that puts us also in a very important position in the coming years of being able to be a conduit. To be a conduit for the slow diplomacy is a slow business, conduit for restoring harmony through dialogue and conversation, and the ability to create an environment in which peace can be achieved. I mean, peace is a tough word, but however close we can get to it. I will just end my remarks on one aspect while discussing peace. We must always remember that there are two kinds of peace. One is the peace of the graveyard, and the other is the peace of the garden. Right? We don't work towards the peace of the graveyard. That the peace of the graveyard imposed by terrorism, by aggression, by mischief, malevolence, by war, by other means. We believe in the peace of a garden. And I think that is really Prime Minister Modi's central objective and purpose.
Minister, the Modi doctrine, you said, is based upon security and development. Now, we are seeing that India has stood up to a neighbor on the west and the neighbor on the north who tried to be adventurous. Especially the neighbor on the west has been pushing India around for some time, sending terrorists in, and India has responded aggressively for the first time to go inside the territory and hit the hideouts of those terrorists. And I think that is a movement in hot pursuit in international diplomacy. And that demonstrates that India will stand up. Even to our neighbor on the north, we are seeing that we have stood up in Galman Valley and we are standing up now in the northern border when they try to be adventurous. And this has also come with certain changes in our economic policy by the banning of the apps of some companies who belong to the northern neighbor, and also tying up with Vietnam to make sure that the sea lanes are kept free. So do you think now this policy, the Modi doctrine of peace and development is also linked to our economic policy to defend our territories, and have security? We will also take appropriate economic decisions to ensure that both go hand in hand. It is not a one-way street anymore.
I'm a little puzzled as why you say will go. It has already gone. It is already being done. Yes.
Yeah.
So, it's very simple. Let us see our relationship with China. The arrangement on the border of, which is still to a certain extent, still there's been no exchange of gunfire. The phrase that is used is peace and tranquility on the border to be maintained, whatever might happen. And then the ability or the willingness of the two sides to ensure the differences do not become disputes and disputes do not become conflicts. Right? But you cannot have business as usual, and perhaps I'm using business also in the specific economic sense. You cannot have business as usual when you are trying to change the ground reality on the line of actual control. And that's a very, very clear message. I mean, nothing walks on a one-way street. Right? The best form of communication is a two-way street, right? Which is mapped diligently and intelligently by both sides. Now, I think previously, whenever such situations have arisen, they have left absolutely no impact on the trade, and which is usually imbalanced in any case, on the trade relationships and on the presence of certain investments or now social media, which may or may not have certain deleterious effects. But now it's very clear that it's either you can't chop peace around. You cannot chop tranquility around. That you can have business as usual on one side of the circle, and definite tensions on the other side of the circle. Harmony is not divisible. So, on this subject, may I simply add one thing, because probably because I know that at some point you will ask this, so let me preempt your question. There is a very important aspect of the present frontier with China, which needs to be understood. Now, let us begin with an obvious fact that there has been no demarcation on the border, and the two countries have different claims. Fair enough. It is known. If there were no differences, there would be no disputes. Now, what exactly is the line of actual control? Regrettably, we at least in India and always have one rather astounding weakness. It's called the weakness of the short memory. Now, actually, how did this line of actual control, who created this line of actual control? This line is one of the outcomes of the 1962 war.
Mhm.
In 1962 war, China invaded across and came deep into Indian territory, not simply in Ladakh, but all the way into Assam. Right. We know the story. It's not a secret that our forces were pushed back. We were not in a position because of certain wrong policies, defense policies over the previous years. We were not in a position in 1962 for a military counteroffensive. Now, but on their own, for a variety of reasons, which we can discuss later, or which are, have been discussed certainly in the dialectic of international relations. On a particular date, in November, the Chinese withdrew to a particular line. We didn't actually put them there. The Chinese withdrew to a particular line. Now, therefore, the line of actual control is a line that was drawn by the Chinese. So, by their own admission or by their own calculation, they are where they are because they think that is where according to their estimate, their border should be. Now, for us to challenge that and say, yes, no, we have claims over it is understandable because we didn't draw that line. But for they drew the line, for them to claim any territory south of that line becomes completely illogical. Today we hear that no, they are interested in the 1959 line. Well, if you believed in the 1959 line, in 1962 you could have stayed at the 1959 line. So they themselves did not accept the 1959 line as an objective line by their calculations. I'm not saying by us. We have not accepted it. So for them to claim that they should have a presence anything south of that line seems to me to be quite illogical.
Sridhar, I'll ask one question, then I'll hand over to you for the global policy.
Sure.
Minister, on the Western front, what is the future of the India-Pakistan relationship? Because Prime Minister Modi reached out to Pakistan, and again, Pakistan stabbed India in the back. They continue to send terrorists. They continue to be double-faced in their international diplomacy. The new Prime Minister, Imran Khan, is aligning with Turkey and abusing India all over the place, lying through his teeth. How do you see the future in the next maybe 2 or 3 years of India-Pakistan relationship?
You can only have peace in an environment of peace. You cannot have peace when one country is holding a gun with one hand and trying to shake your hand with the other. Right? So as long as terrorism continues to be a cardinal policy of Pakistan, it is very difficult for any government in our country to accept it. Right? And therefore, you can't clap with one hand. And it's very difficult to see any progress towards our West. Previous prime ministers have made every effort. Prime Minister Modi, in the first days, the first thing he did was, for his swearing-in ceremony in 2014, he called SAARC countries, knowing full well that the Pakistan Prime Minister would also be there. Again, he repeated it. He actually once made more than the required diplomatic effort to create a thaw. But each time when Prime Minister Vajpayee went and made that bus trip to Lahore, what a significant stride it was. You should hear the language that Prime Minister Vajpayee used in order to create a new environment. And what happened? What happened? All his efforts, the moment he comes back from Lahore, the moment he says that yes, a prosperous Pakistan is in India's interest, what more can he say? What does India get? India gets Kargil. Right? It tears up every single agreement that is made, because there remains a whole nexus in Pakistan which is backed completely by their armed forces, which will simply never allow any peace with our country, because they know that if there is peace between the two nations, and not a peace based on completely unacceptable claims, but a peace based on the legality of the situation, that if there is peace between India and Pakistan, then the most powerful element within Pakistan can no longer have the domestic power that it has. We are in a strange situation where today a former Pakistani former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, is actually saying that the army should not have so much domestic power. And in a democracy, the army is only an institution for the defense of the country. It is not an institution to rule the country. So how can the army control the nation's foreign policy? How can the army control the nation's security policy? How can the army control the nation's media policy? How can the army control the nation's home policy? How can the army control just about everything except that which bores it? So when a former prime minister and all opposition parties are actually asking for a true democratization in Pakistan, because in a democracy, only the democratically elected government can have power, nobody else. Right? In no democracy, proper democracy, can an army have political views or intervene in political space. But when their own Pakistanis say that this is how democracy should function, the Pakistani Prime Minister, unfortunately, says that this is being done at India's behest, which is, which is silly. But I think the Pakistan Prime Minister would be far better advised to listen to the Pakistani people.
Yes, sir, Sri.
Viewers, we are taking questions for this debate. We are about 35 minutes into this conversation, perhaps another 15 minutes, and then we will be able to take a few questions. Please keep the questions on the topic. Thank you very much. Over to you, sir. Sridhar, you can take over.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Now, Sridhar, all yours.
Yeah. Thanks, Mohan. Thank you, sir. So coming to the two tenets, which is security and trade.
Development. Security and development.
So coming to the two tenets, security and development, there's been a range of agreements that have been signed from Indian Ocean going all the way to in what is now called Indo-Pacific, and including now India's role in South China Sea, which has not happened before, and most recently the access to Vietnam, where Vietnam granting access to its port for the Indian Navy. So what has been the driving force behind these changes under Modi ji's leadership?
I don't want to discuss any sea named after a particular country, but our policy on the oceans is very clear, and Prime Minister Modi is absolutely crystal clear on the subject, that freedom of navigation and security of navigation cannot be hostage to any power, superpower, regional power, or whatever. These are international rights. These are international rights which have been guaranteed under the framework of treaties like UNCLOS. These are rights that are indivisible, and nobody can block them by creating, what I would truly call artificial hurdles. And I use that term advisedly because many artificial hurdles and claims have been created. So, and I think there is a large consensus in most parts of the world that yes, what is true of other oceans must also be true of the Indian Ocean and the Indo-Pacific. As you know, there are bottlenecks in that. The Malacca Straits is one such potential bottleneck, and there is always concern that this bottleneck could be, a source of tension, of conflict, and therefore, naturally, as one of the world's reasonably important trading partners, it is in our interest to ensure that there are no bottles, not just for our ships, but for any nation ships.
Right. So coming to the next question around the world moving away from expansionism, the One Belt, One Road initiative, which is more about expansionism, as one can observe in the recent past, most of the government, including the United Nations, remain passive until our president, Mr. Trump, stepped in and opposed it. And of course, India has always had opposed the One Belt, One Road initiative. And where do you see that and how that was ignored by nations until Mr. Trump stepped in?
Our reason for opposing OBOR is very simple. You cannot have a third country going through our territory. As simple as that. Right? Somebody wants to build roads somewhere else. Most welcome. Please go ahead. The terms of investment required in this infrastructure, somebody will have to pay the price. And if another country is willing to pay the price, many countries have now realized that the price is too high.
Right.
And but they have to live with decisions that they have made. I think the enthusiasm with which certain ideas were being promulgated even 3 years ago, that enthusiasm has ebbed significantly as as reality has struck home. There is much more interested and objective examination of what precisely these means going on in Europe, going on in many countries. And, the world has realized the meaning of debt. The meaning of debt came into focus in the 1960s and 70s in Africa. Right, when people realize that there is nothing called a free lunch, let alone free foreign aid. The word foreign aid itself is less aid and more, misdemeanor was. So we have moved towards a new financial cooperation systems, which are backed up by international institutions, which also have changed. I don't think the World Bank and IMF are what they were in 1970s. So as the world changes and as the world moves towards better understanding of each other's, of the meaning of cooperation, institutions and people who run governments also change.
Hmm. So I think within that kind of framework, I mean, hindsight is what led to the notion of debt as opposed to the strategic driver, which was around trade. The trade will be its free movement of goods and services. There's still an economic and security debate within United States, which is to say the concept of multilateralism versus global trade through one single agreement is what was the foundation, and that should not be broken. And China had continued to move along that path without it offering itself. So many of these facets that we are talking about was people turned a blind eye, knowing the knowing, but now realizing that it is what it is. But no leadership stepped up until Trump came in. I think that's still there is this what I call denial syndrome, that this unilateral free trade agreement without checks and balances does not work. And which has been the driver of this whole war initiative.
Let me respond to that on a on a larger note, which is everybody approaches a trade policy from the perspective of its national interest. And the perception of your national interest, can take you in certain directions. Now, national interest, it is mistakenly believed that national interest must of necessity be hostile to every other interest. It is not. We live in a world which is increasingly interconnected. We cannot, we cannot have aggression by armies. You cannot have aggression by gunboat diplomacy either. The days after colonialism is a consequence of trade. Trade is not a consequence of colonialism. Economic policy became a consequence of colonialism, as British policy towards India proved after the British Raj was established. But colonialism was a byproduct of trade, and and its many manifestations. Therefore, the creating a balance between the national and international interest, always keeping in mind that we need both, that one cannot be exclusive of the other. Our Prime Minister surprised some friends in Southeast Asia by refusing to sign on a particular dotted line, right, on trade. Now, he had very good reasons, because, he has, he worries he's not going to be swayed by rhetoric and so on. He is going to be, first concern is India's interest. Now, certainly with superpowers and powers, we want a working relationship which is, again, mutually beneficial. Of course, irritants always come up. Sometimes you'll be surprised at how, in retrospect, minor things seem to become such big, right, dams and barriers. But however, now, even one of the important things, for example, to recall, is how in the 1990s, Narasimha Rao managed to build a new equation with America without changing the defense equation with post-Soviet Union Russia. That was excellent management of relations. even as he embarked on a new navigation, which was look east.
Right.
So it is, the ability to think on many levels and then harmonize this thinking into cogent policy that I would describe as Prime Minister Modi's basically quintessential ability.
Yeah. No, I think it's very fair to say in hindsight today, which not many people speak about, the Modi's policy of abstaining from signing the treaty has stood not only India, but all the nations in the right context. Because everybody is now following Modi's policy to that extent. But nobody's talking about it. But I think your point is extremely well made as to his vision in terms of like one walks away from that message. His vision has found to be an excellent kind of perspective in today's context.
Minister, very quick question, quick answer. Does the climate change policy of the government of India in tune with the Modi doctrine of looking at the world as one family? Because India refreshingly led the talks in COP21 in Paris.
You must always, it's a good point, but we must always understand why India was in a leadership position in Paris. These things don't happen by accident. I mean, the world does not simply react and put you on a particular pedestal just because, you had a cheerful morning. The reason is because Prime Minister Modi, his vision of climate change was made known to the world when he was Gujarat Chief Minister.
Oh.
He was a great innovator. The solar street lights, I think they're still working in Gandhinagar, right? But they were installed by him. He actually led the movement for what is today become famous after Paris. He led the movement for such change. He is in a remarkably, visionary mode. And he has done it ever since he became the Gujarat Chief Minister.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, Sri.
I will hand over to Sri.
Thank you, Sridhar ji. Thank you, Mohandas Pai ji, and thank you, Akbar ji, for a very revealing conversation about Modi doctrine. We have a few questions, and I promise you these are all very good questions. The first one is from Dave Sam. Why has the MEA and policymakers dropped using the term Indian subcontinent? Suddenly, everybody talks about South Asia.
Well, I mean, the place by any other name, remains what it was. The geopolitics of South Asia will demand specific understanding. What is also true is that, we recognize the very important fact that there are independent nations on this subcontinent, right? And this recognition has been made very specific. It's in our bilateral relations and so on and so forth. And I think it is important not to, if you can protect the peace by making your language acceptable, I suppose there is some merit in it.
The next question is from Subhajit Paul. How will Pakistan's elevation of Gilgit-Baltistan to a full province impact Indian position on J&K? After all, legally, it is Indian territory.
Yes, it will not impact our position at all. I mean, Pakistan can do what it likes, but the fact is that the whole of Jammu and Kashmir is a part of India. And the whole of Jammu and Kashmir is defined by the geography of what it was under the Maharaja. So, that is what it is. That does not change. I think perhaps our neighbors to the west, not very fertile with ideas, try and play catch up, semantic catch up.
Samyukta Challa wants to know, what is India's stand on the Armenia-Azerbaijan war that is currently happening?
It's a war which has regional demographic realities. And you can see the stand from the basis of which how many countries recognize what.
That answers your question, Samyukta. The next question is from Babai. Why didn't Modi acknowledge birthday wishes from Taiwan's Prime Minister? At the least, he could have liked her comment. That should have been also part of Modi doctrine. I don't know if this is true or not, sir, so please feel free to weigh in on this.
Well, I think one thing we can be very clear about, that the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi ji, knows what is India's best interest.
Yash Ram wants to know, can you tell how the outcome of US elections will impact our relationship with the US with respect to defense ties and with that of China and Pakistan?
As far as defense ties are concerned, it is always important to remember that India's relationship, the strategic relationship with India, or between India and America, was raised to the highest level under President Barack Obama. So we should not certainly expect any change in that relationship. And these are continuums. Policy is a continuum. As for what happens in terms of American policy, it's meaningless to discuss it. I think it is important to wait until the people have spoken in any democracy. It is important to wait until the people of India spoke in 2019 before discussing what would be the policy of government. And today it is important for us to wait until the American people have spoken. They are a democracy. They will speak exactly as they wish.
The next question, sir, is from Sukrit Kulsreshta. How do Myanmar, Laos, Vietnam, and Philippines look at India because of the tough time that they are facing from China? How do you think these countries are looking as things are playing out now?
I think they're looking with a very friendly basis. Even as we talk, I think the foreign minister and the army chief of India have either left for Myanmar or on the way to Myanmar or preparing to go. And I think our warm relationships with all the countries to our east, and particularly our warm relationships with Bangladesh and so on, have survived the test of this 20 years of this century. And I think that is one area in which we can expect very fertile and positive developments over the next 20 years.
Thank you very much, sir. And thank you again, Mohan Das Paiji and Sridhar Chittiala ji. That was a fascinating discussion today. And we'll be back with more such fireside chats. And we hope to have you back with us, sir. And once again, namaskar. And thanks for watching our channel.
Thank you all very much, and namaskar to everyone.